Good afternoon, everyone. Please be seated. My name is Andrei Baikov. I'm Vice President in charge of International Partnerships and Graduate Programs at MGIMO. This is the second lecture in a series of 3 lectures that Professor Marta Finnemore has kindly agreed to deliver to our students. For those of you who missed the first lecture, I'll give a brief introduction of Professor Finnemore, who you should know by now is one of the big names in the theory of international relations. She is a university professor of political science and international affairs at George Washington University in Washington. Her research is mostly on global governance, international organizations, and social theory. She's published some very influential books in the field: National Interest in International Society, The Purpose of Intervention, The Rules for the World, and some others that help to promote and advance the agenda of constructivism. As you probably know, for those of you who were here last time, in a survey in 2009, she was named as one of the 5 scholars whose work has made the biggest impact on the field in the past years. She is also the fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. This is the second lecture, which she chose to devote to her second book that I mentioned on the list, which is devoted to the purpose of intervention, the norms of intervention, and how this has evolved over the years. With this, I'll finish and give the floor to Professor Finnemore. Please join me in welcoming her again.
Thank you, Professor Baikov, for that kind introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming today. As Professor Baikov said, the talk today will be based on a book that I wrote about military intervention. And in writing this book, I was interested in the role that ideas play in shaping the way states understand their own national interests, and the way ideas play in shaping the way states choose to deploy military force across national borders. Conventional international relations theory, realists, liberals, have not been very interested in ideas in their analyses, certainly not in the last 30 or 40 years. And in these theories, states deploy force to pursue national interests and goals, but usually those goals are quite static, quite obvious, and not at all a subject of scholarly concern. States intervene militarily. They use their armies to achieve things because they are pursuing their own security, they are pursuing their own wealth, and security and wealth are not problematic. There's nothing unobvious about how you would perceive these goals. The theories simply assume all states want security, all states want wealth. That's all we need to know. And how you get security, how you get wealth is obvious to me as an analyst, and it's obvious to the actors on the ground who are actually deploying armies and trying to get these things. In this book, I take a very different kind of analytical approach. In the book, I argue that changing ideas about what force is and what it can accomplish radically changes the way states choose to deploy their armies over time. New ideas shape what states believe their interests are. New ideas change what states think is right, what they think is good, what they think is valuable. New ideas change what states think military force is good for. It changes what they think they can accomplish with military force. So the research question for this book and for this project is, when is it legitimate? When is it acceptable? And when will other states think it's legitimate and acceptable to use military force across borders? What are the rules? What rules do states construct among themselves? What rules do they think apply? And how do those rules change over time? Now, realists might say, there are no rules. The strong do what they can. The weak suffer what they must. Someone who works in social constructivism and constructivist theory would have a very different approach. They would say, not necessarily. There are definitely rules about force and how it's used, and we know this because there's such a huge uproar, hue and cry, when the rules get broken. States themselves know there are rules about when you use armies, when you use force, and they have to factor the costs of rule breaking, if they break those rules, into their foreign policy decisions. So, for example, in 2003, when the George W. Bush invaded Iraq, without a resolution of support from the UN Security Council, there was a huge uproar. Big split in NATO. The NATO allies, they all abandoned, most of them abandoned except Britain. Big political costs to the United States. And when Russia annexed Crimea, there was a big hue and cry. Other states objected. They said this is against the rules. Both of those episodes were seen by other states as violations of the rules. Those were not just business as usual. So my question, what interests me as a scholar, is how do we know what the rules are? How do states know what the rules are? Where do the rules come from? How do the rules change over time? So in my talk today, what I want to do is briefly sketch some theoretical issues and explain why military intervention is an interesting lens through which to examine these questions about when and how states use force. And then I'll briefly describe two cases. One is about states using their armies, their force, their military force, to collect debts owed by governments to the nationals of a state. And the other case will be about humanitarian intervention, using military force to save citizens who are not your own citizens from grievous harm. I could have approached this in a very different kind of way. I could have investigated changing patterns about the use of force by studying war and not intervention. That would be a very different theoretical lens. But I decided that military intervention was more interesting, theoretically. Military intervention is interesting theoretically because it sets the boundary conditions for two central features of international life. Sovereignty, on the one hand, state sovereignty. It sets the boundaries for that, and on the other hand, it sets the boundaries for what is war. Sovereignty and war are two foundational institutions of international politics. But how is this so? How does intervention set these boundaries? Intervention sets the boundaries on state sovereignty in that a necessary condition for sovereignty to exist in the world, for sovereign states to exist in the world, is non-intervention. A necessary condition for sovereignty is state restraint. It's not sending in your troops every time there's a gain to be had. Sovereignty only exists because strong states are restrained. It exists because powerful states don't intervene in other states whenever there is some gain to be had. If states intervened freely in one another's affairs, whenever they could get something useful out of it, we would live in a very different world. If Russia or China or the United States just marched into smaller countries anytime they felt like it, anytime there was some gain to be had, we would have very different politics than the world politics we see now. Power asymmetries are just so large, so enormous in the world today, that the vast majority of the world's 194, I think, states could not mount any meaningful defense if one of the great powers decided to invade. It's precisely because states restrain themselves and they don't intervene that we live in a world of sovereign states at all. So non-intervention, this practice of restraint, is what constitutes sovereignty as a social fact, for those of you who were here at the last lecture. Non-intervention is what allows most states to be sovereign at all. For most states, most of the time, you only are a state. You only have sovereign control because other states allow it, because they choose not to intervene in your country. So understanding why states don't intervene or do intervene tells us a lot about the boundaries of sovereignty and the structure of a system of sovereign states. But the other foundational institution here is war. And I would argue intervention also tells us something about how do states understand war as a practice of states, as an activity of states? What counts as a war? Military intervention, deploying troops across boundaries, is clearly not peaceful activity. But states are at great pains to distinguish between interventions, military interventions, and war. States understand intervention as different from war. You can see it in their language, you can see it in their diplomacy. But what those differences are can be very hard to figure out if you're an analyst and a scholar, as we are. How can then we as analysts distinguish intervention from war? Well, in writing this book, I spent a long time trying to figure this out. And I ran through a bunch of possibilities. How could I think about this problem? Is it the case, for example, I wondered, that a formal declaration of war is what tells me this one's a war, this is an intervention? Seemed like a good possibility, but it doesn't hold up. Formal declarations of war cannot be the difference, what distinguishes intervention and war. States mostly have stopped declaring war post-1945. The United States has not declared war on anyone at any time since 1941. But it has certainly deployed all kinds of troops in all sorts of places in the world in very unpeaceful ways. And American policymakers and the American public talk about wars since 1945. We talk about a Korean War, we talk about a Vietnam War. We call those things war, but there was no declaration of war for any of those things. So this notion that the formal declaration is what makes it a war seems analytically not to be useful. It doesn't hold up. So I thought about another possibility. I said, maybe the difference between intervention and war, it lies in sort of the size and scope of objectives, the size of and ambition of the goals that states are trying to achieve. That might be what distinguishes intervention from war. And interventions somehow are smaller, they're less ambitious than wars. But that doesn't hold up either. Interventions are often not little, and they are often not very limited in their aims. Interventions often aim at wholesale regime change, as when the US went into Nicaragua in the 1980s and other Central American states looking to overthrow whole governments. They often occupy and annex territory. Crimea would be, again, a recent example. So these non-wars seem often to be quite ambitious in their aims. And the converse is also true. Wars often do not conquer territory or annex territory. The Allied powers in 1945 did not annex Germany or Japan after World War II, but we would never call World War II an intervention. It was a war. So war aims and objectives don't seem like a very sturdy analytical tool to distinguish what is war and what is intervention. So what to do? I tried then a very standard social science move. I began to look for an objective definition, and I would use this definition, hold it up to all cases, and say, is it an intervention or not? Does it meet my definition or not? I looked at lots and lots of scholarly writing on military intervention. Most of this writing happens during the Cold War in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s when the Soviet Union and the US are intervening around the world to protect their allies and spheres of influence. And the definition that scholars were using was that military intervention is the deployment of military personnel across recognized borders for the purpose of changing political authority structures in the place you are intervening. And in the Cold War, that was actually a pretty good definition, because that's what the Soviet Union and the United States were trying to do. They wanted friendly governments in these countries, so they wanted to change the governments. But I was interested in a long sweep of history. And outside of the Cold War period, this definition is not very helpful. Before World War II, in the early part of the 20th century, the US often deployed force and didn't care at all about the political authority structure of the governments. For example, in the early 20th century, the US deployed military force to collect debts that Latin American countries owed to US financiers. They weren't occupying the country, they weren't changing the government, they just wanted their money. That's all they wanted. So this does not fit their definition, but when you look at the discourse of the time, everyone involved said this is a military intervention. They used that language. The Latin Americans were very clear they were suffering a military intervention. The Americans were very clear we're doing a military intervention, but it doesn't fit this scholarly definition. In another example, going even farther back in time, to the 17th and 18th centuries, I quickly discovered that the participants in military deployments had no concept of a thing called military intervention. They were very clear that as a matter of statecraft and principle, there were two categories of existence. You were at war, or you were not at war. And it was bad statecraft to confuse the two. You wanted no intermediate category-like intervention. That was not only nonsensical, it was dangerous because you didn't want to be confused about whether you were at war or not. So as a researcher and a scholar, what do you do with this? My solution was to make the changing definitions part of the subject of the book. Instead of looking at an event and saying, is this an intervention? Is it not an intervention? Does it meet my definition? Does it not meet my definition? I would look at military deployments across borders and ask, do the participants doing these deployments and suffering these invasions, what do they think is going on? Do they think this is an intervention? What are the interveners trying to accomplish? What do they think are the rules about whether this is acceptable activity or not acceptable activity? So a case in this project is not a single intervention. A case is a change in the pattern of interventions. It's a change in the way states as a group, the states in the international system, understood what constitutes a legitimate use of force, a legitimate military intervention. It's a change in the rules about when states can use force. So let me, going forward, I want to do two things. I want to preview some themes and findings that I found around this question, and then give a couple of examples about how these changes happened in the world. So the research questions, just to remind everyone, are two. The first one was, when and why do states think it's legitimate to deploy force across borders? And the second research question, how and why do those perceptions of legitimate use of force change? What made states change their mind about when it's okay to use military force? I looked at three cases of changes in the pattern of interventions. And I looked at intervention to collect debts, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. I looked at humanitarian intervention, intervention to protect foreign citizens from wars and catastrophes in their country. And third, I looked at intervention to promote and protect international order. This turns out to be a common justification for intervening, but what states think is orderly and what they think the order should be, so what constitutes a good intervention changes over the centuries. What do I find? Pulling together several threads of these broad, sweeping analyses, there are at least 3 broad themes that I thought were interesting and worth attention. One is that over the centuries, there has been a steady erosion of the normative force, the goodness that we ascribe to military force as a tool of statecraft. War used to be glorious. It used to be something that states wanted, that they sought, because that's how you showed yourself to be a successful state and a successful monarch. And it was a legitimate use of force to say, I need more glory for my state, so I'm going to start a war. Now, if Putin or Trump or Xi stood up and said that, people would be appalled. It's not okay to do that anymore. Second theme in these military intervention cases is that there's an increasing power of norms about equality in the international system that shape the way we use force. And equality runs in 2 dimensions. Sovereign equality, equality among states, becomes a much more powerful understanding as you move from the 18th to the 19th to the 20th and 21st centuries. There used to be notions that sovereigns were not equal. There were great powers and there were lesser powers. Everyone understood that, and great powers had special rights. Now, not so much. There are, especially encoded in international law, strong notions that states as sovereigns are equal. And this has consequences for uses of force. Human equality also has changed in its power. There is more respect for human equality and especially human rights. And humanitarian claims for protection have become much more visible as a reason and justification for states to deploy force. Third, Weberian notions of rational legal authority, to use Max Weber's term for this, international bureaucracy would be another way to talk about this. That has become increasingly influential in the way states use force. International law has become much more visible in governing states' choices about how they use force and when it's legitimate. And international organizations increasingly shape whether states as a group, the international community of states, will accept your intervention as legitimate or not. So I said I would offer a couple of illustrations, examples, to show how some of these changes have come about. Let me start with this case of military intervention to collect sovereign debts. These are debts that national governments have incurred with private actors, usually in rich countries, but can no longer pay back the debt. States use force to collect debts. I mean, in domestic politics, we have mechanisms to deal with people who default on debts, who don't pay. Courts, governments will take you to jail if you do not pay your debts. Internationally, this has always been much more problematic. It's hard to take a state to jail. We just don't have a mechanism to replicate the domestic process. Now, in the post-45 world, we have the International Monetary Fund to deal with defaulting countries, but for most of history, there was no good mechanism. If a sovereign government borrowed money, there was no good way for private actors to collect. Until the early part of the 20th century, it was accepted practice for state governments to use military force to collect debts that were owed to their nationals, their financiers, their finance community, by a foreign government. The practice is most common in Latin America in the late 19th, early 20th century. Governments there were borrowing heavily on European and North American capital markets to build railroads. This is the period of industrialization. All these governments are trying to build railroads all over their country. Latin American states, like everybody else, are trying to build governments. They need money. They borrow. And guess what? These are weak, unstable governments, and often they cannot pay their debts. Conventional IR theories would find military intervention to collect these debts absolutely unremarkable, absolutely what they would expect. In an anarchic environment where there's no higher authority to enforce a contract, self-help should dominate. And we would expect states to help their nationals, their citizens, their bankers, recover the investments they've made in a foreign government by military force if necessary. And often these bankers and financiers are very powerful domestic actors. They're very able to put pressure on their government saying, help me get my debt, send in the troops, get my money. And the other feature of this that's important is this was easy to do. It was not hard for states to carry out these interventions. You didn't need to invade the country. You did not need to pacify the population. All you needed to do was send in big gunboats to the ports, the major ports, take over the customs collection for customs duties and tariffs until you had all your money, turn around, go home. You're done. Your citizens have their money, and there's no downside if you are collecting these debts. This was accepted practice. It was clearly not peaceable in that blockades are an act of war under international law, but states accepted this as legitimate. Why the puzzle for researchers is, why does the practice stop? Weak states are not suddenly getting more powerful. There's no technological breakthrough that makes this more difficult than it used to be. It's still easy to do. And there is no shortage of defaulting states. In fact, the practice stops and comes to be viewed as illegitimate at exactly the point when foreign weak state governments are defaulting the most, when weak state borrowing is expanding and defaulting is expanding. Why would you give up this practice since it works? What's going on here? That's the kind of research question that would interest me for this project. I argue in the book that what changes here is understandings states held about two things. States' understandings about the relationship between contractual obligation. I made a contract with somebody. What obligations does everyone have? The relationship between that and sovereign authority. That understanding changes, and the other thing that changes is understandings about legitimate use of force. It works like this. When states intervened militarily to collect debts, they justified their actions on legal grounds. They told other states exactly what they were doing. This is completely in the open because it's an accepted practice. They say, this government owes my people money. They've defaulted, they're refusing to pay. I am using force to collect an honest debt. And no one disputed these governments borrowed the money of their own free will. It was a legitimate contract. Absent any international authority to enforce the contract, creditor governments were using force to secure justice. A debt was owed, using force to collect was fine. And that's the way other states viewed this, and that was the argument states made and understood. And in that argument, pacta sunt servanda, the contract will be served, will be honored, is this bedrock international legal principle, and the practice follows that very basic principle. But in the early 20th century, weak states started pushing back, and they did so on this same legal terrain. The justification was legal, so weak states said, I have a better legal argument. And this is the argument they made. They said, this incident, this debt collection, is not about pacta sunt servanda. The relevant legal principle here is sovereign equality of states. Sovereign equality of states is a basic principle of international order. And big states, strong states, cannot legitimately use force against weak states except in self-defense. A legal interpretation that lets strong states use force for other reasons just makes a mockery, a joke, out of the sovereignty of weak states and the independence of weak states. It made weak states no better than colonies. So sovereign states, weak states, these Latin American states in particular, were very organized and reframed the argument. They said, no, 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 you don't understand what's happening here. What this dispute is not about contracts, this dispute is about the nature of sovereignty. And with this new argument, they were able to persuade other states they were right. And specifically, they were able to persuade states to sign an international treaty at The Hague in 1907 that barred this practice of sending in your navy to collect debts by force. So how did they persuade them? I mean, strong states are often only accept things that are in their interest. Why would they change their mind? This is a case where the rise of lawyers and the international legal profession in interstate politics makes a big difference. This treaty was drafted at a series of conventions in the late 19th, early 20th century. They were called the Hague Peace Conferences in the run-up to World War I. The first one happened in 1899, convened by Tsar Nicholas. But Tsar Nicholas did not care at all about debts. I mean, sovereign debts, this was not anything he cared about. What he cared about was arms control. So he invited states to come to The Hague to talk arms control because he was worried about rising German power, rising British power, and wanted to get a grip on what was happening here. But when you start a conference, you can't always control what will be put on the agenda by other states at the conference. People put a court of arbitration on the agenda for states to discuss in 1899. In 1899, delegates to the conference were military people. It was an arms control conference. States sent as delegates generals, admirals, people in the military. And they did not care about a court of arbitration. They did not care about law. And so they ignored this proposal and did not pass it. But there were lawyers in the room. They went back to their national capitals. And when the second Hague Conference happens in 1907, it is announced that this court of arbitration will be on the agenda, and states send lawyers to this conference. Arbitration is a legal practice, so they want to make sure they have legal delegates who can oversee this conversation. There were also a whole lot more states at the 1907 conference. Latin American states actually got to come to the 1907 conference. They weren't invited to the 1899 conference. So this switch in who comes changes the conversation. The idea of having a legal resolution, an arbitration of international debts done by lawyers, made all kinds of sense to delegates who were lawyers. They said, great idea, we like this, and they signed. And since the delegates were lawyers more than military people, this passes in 1907 and the practice stops. So what creates change here? Professional norms matter a lot. It matters what kinds of delegates states choose to send as their agents to international negotiations. A conference of lawyers will find very different proposals persuasive than a conference of soldiers. Another thing that creates change here is changing attitudes toward use of military force. This is the run-up to World War I. In these years before World War I, states are quite worried, or certainly civilians and populations are quite worried. And there's a rising understanding that law is morally superior way to resolve disputes. It's morally superior to force and war. And this undergirds a lot of civil society activity. There are peace movements in the early 20th century in Europe and the United States, elsewhere, and they are shifting the conversation internally in national capitals about whether and how war is glorious and good. War is something to be avoided at this period. So it's very different from Louis XIV, who was looking for glorious wars. A second case that I looked at for this book is changing patterns in the way we use force for humanitarian protection, the way we would call it humanitarian intervention. And the puzzle here is, why would states ever use force to protect citizens who are not their own citizens? It's pretty easy to explain why states would use force to rescue their own people. States have always done this. They continue to do this. But why would any state risk their own soldiers, their own citizens in uniform, to protect other people's citizens? But they do this. And as I was writing this book, it was the 1990s and early 2000s, this suddenly became a very frequent practice. Suddenly, the United States is doing these humanitarian interventions in Somalia, in Cambodia, where Pol Pot is slaughtering his people. The U.S. has no geostrategic interest in any of these places after the Cold War. They don't care. Why would they do this? NATO is doing these operations. The UN is doing peacekeeping operations. What kind of interest could this possibly be for states? Why do they care? What is the purpose that states are trying to achieve in using military force? So states are claiming what they say they're doing is humanitarian. But as I started looking at all of these episodes, I discovered a number of things have changed over time. Two things in particular. Who counts as human? Who's a human being and recognized as a human being by governments has actually changed. Who can actually claim protection has changed. And how states intervened has changed. It used to be you could do this by yourself anytime you wanted. Now, not so much. You need multilateral approval by a big international organization to make a humanitarian intervention legitimate. And we can see the change if we compare humanitarian intervention in the 19th century to humanitarian intervention in the post-45 period, or the post-1990 period. I mean, it turns out when I started this project in the 1990s and early 2000s, I thought that humanitarian intervention was this brand new thing. 1990s interventions that were the US and NATO were doing, I thought, oh, this has never happened before. You learn things when you do research. You uncover new facts that you did not know exist. It turns out states have been doing this for at least 200 years, but the way they do it has changed. So in the 19th century, when states did humanitarian interventions, most of these were European states intervening to protect people from slaughter by the crumbling Ottoman Empire and its troops. So there's an intervention by a number of European states in 1820s around the Greek Wars of Independence in Greece. There's a unilateral French intervention in Lebanon, Syria in the 1860s, where France is trying to protect Maronite Christians for slaughter by Ottoman Janissaries. And there's an intervention that Russia is involved in Bulgaria in the 1870s. What's interesting about this to me is who can and who cannot successfully get protected. So all of the people who get protection in the 19th century, all of the people who get protection are white and they're Christians. So Jews who are suffering pogroms, no one's intervening to protect them. Chinese are being slaughtered in the Taiping's rebellion. No one wants to protect them. The United States military is massacring Native Americans. Nobody wants to intervene to protect them. Only white Christians get protection in the 19th century. The other thing that's interesting about these 19th century episodes is states didn't seem to care how they happened. It could be multilateral, like the Greek intervention. Could be unilateral, like this French action in Syria and Lebanon. You could do it either way. It was fine. And the third thing that is visible in these 19th century interventions is that transnational civil society, that's what we might call it now, NGOs maybe we would call them now, these played a big, big role in determining the government's attitudes and motivating governments in Europe to do these things in the 19th century. We think of this, I thought of this, as clearly a modern phenomenon. No, it's not. It turns out you don't need the internet, you don't need social media to activate lots of civil society groups. Churches are extremely interested in protecting Christians from Muslims who want to slaughter them and get very mobilized about this. Liberal elites get interested in this. Lord Byron, the poet, went off to Greece in the 1820s and was part of the fight there to save Christians in Greece. So this is not the idea that civil society groups shape state policy. This is not just a 21st century thing. This is old news. But that's a very different pattern, I think, than the post-1945 and particularly the post-1990 period. Post-1990, most of the humanitarian interventions that are going on are not to help white Christians. It's exactly the opposite. Most of the 1990s, 2000s interventions are to help non-white, non-Christian people around the world. It's Somalia, Cambodia, Central African Republic, all kinds of places. This does not mean that all non-white, non-Christians who ask for help get it. The Rwandans understand very well that even if you ask for help, maybe no one will come. So this is a permissive practice. The question is whether you're allowed to do this. You are not required to do this, but I'll come back to that in a minute. So states will sometimes intervene to protect different kinds of people, people who would not have registered on the radar of these 19th century policymakers. So who is human and can claim protection has changed by the 1990s. The second thing that's changed is you have to do a contemporary humanitarian intervention with multilateral approval if you want other states to accept it as a legitimate practice. It's very hard to claim a humanitarian justification if you cannot get sort of a permission slip, approval from some kind of multilateral organization. It's best if it's the United Nations. George W. Bush, for example, tried to claim the Iraq War was a humanitarian exercise of force, and other states just laughed and rejected this claim. They didn't believe him. And he had no UN authorization. They were very vocal about this. So just to wrap up, these shared understandings about how states can and should use force have changed in patterns over time in the international system. And I would say that the process of change about what the rules are, when it's okay to use your force across borders in other people's countries, this is still an ongoing issue that states are still debating. And the most prominent place I think those debates are happening is over this notion of responsibility to protect that has been embodied in United Nations resolutions starting in, I think, 2005. This is hugely controversial. But it's controversial in part because it redefines sovereignty, which is something states care a lot about. Responsibility to protect is an effort to reshape sovereignty, to change sovereignty from being a bunch of rights that states have, sovereign rights for states. R2P wants to say, states, yes, you have rights, but states, you also have responsibilities. You have responsibilities, for example, not to kill your own people, And you have some responsibilities to make sure other states aren't killing their own people. And you have some obligation to people in other states if they're being slaughtered by their own governments. This is very controversial. There's one group of states who are arguing for one set of rules and another set of states that are pushing back on this. This is normal in the way these rules change. Some minds have been changed by the people pushing for responsibility to protect. Some minds have not been changed about this. But again, this is the way these patterns unfold. Often these understandings are contested for long periods before the pattern settles out. I don't know where this pattern is going, but I think it's a fascinating thing to watch for us as scholars, because it's about this very important theoretical problem about what are sovereign rights and maybe sovereign responsibilities for using force across borders in other states. So thank you very much for listening, and if anyone has questions. Yes, please.
Before asking the question that I prepared, I'd like to greet you here in MGIMO. We are very happy to see you here. And what's more, I'd like to say thank you for the lecture. As we know, you mentioned that states do use force if they want to collect debts. So as we all know, the U.S. has a very huge external debt. And from your point of view, what can the international community do to get the money back? Thank you.
And thank you for that very good question. This is part of this, these changing patterns over time. I mean, one of the things that comes about in this area of debt collection is, so states used to go in with their troops to collect the debts, then they decide not to do that. But debt continues to be a problem, so they create another mechanism to create debts, one that does not involve force, military force. They create a bureaucracy. States love bureaucracies, and they create the IMF to help bureaucratize the collection of debts. So as I would read this across history, we used to collect debts with soldiers. Now we collect debts with bureaucrats. We set a bureaucracy out there to figure out ways to get money back from sovereign governments who borrow from the IMF and cannot repay their debts. But this, I think, fits with this long-standing pattern of states. They used to think that military force was a very good tool for this purpose of collecting debts. They changed their minds. They say, we don't like this tool so much. But they do then create a new tool because they still want to get their money back. But it's not a tool of force. It's a tool of bureaucracy. I have a whole line of research about bureaucracy. I think bureaucrats are very interesting and very strange. I think the IMF is a very strange, odd place. But that's another conversation. But I see the problem doesn't go away, but states decide to create a different tool for the same purpose. And it's not guns. Yes, please.
Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Dr. Finnemore, thank you so much for coming all the way to Moscow and giving this lovely lecture. My question is about interventions, obviously. You briefly touched upon this issue already, but I want you to precise from the point of view of your theory, because you say that values matter and international law matters, and etc., etc. Because my question is pretty easy to answer from a point of view of a realist, but from your point of view, I wonder. So why do great powers in general, and the United States in particular, in certain cases choose to intervene and use military force, while in other similar cases, they choose to steer clear and wait how it goes from the distance? you mentioned the example of Rwanda in 1994 when genocide was taking place there. The international community chose to do almost nothing or very little to prevent it. On the other hand, 5 years later, in 1999, why did the US-led coalition decide to intervene in former Yugoslavia? What is the difference between the cases? Thank you.
Again, this is another excellent question. I do not pretend to have a theory that I can predict all the interventions. To make any military intervention happen requires a coalition of policymakers inside a government. Okay, so there are some states where one leader can just decide we're going, but most often you actually have to get a team of people inside a government to actually all agree on this, and they have different reasons. The other thing, to the two cases that you just mentioned, I think are interesting because I think the past influences the future in state, or at least it influences the present in policymaking. One of the reasons I would argue that there was an intervention in Yugoslavia and not in Rwanda was, well, twofold. One, the Rwandan genocide caused so much pushback, the non-intervention was costly in domestic political circles for the Clinton administration. This was a problem for them. They were getting a lot of criticism for this. But it's also the case that I think the US military wanted not to be fighting in Rwanda. They would rather be fighting in Yugoslavia. So if I had to guess, this is what my sources told me at the time, that the military said, we're not going to do both of these, we're only going to do one, and the one we're going to do is Yugoslavia. But I think by the time you get to Kosovo, which is 5 years after Rwanda, you know, that's when the lesson learning happens, right? They had 5 years to digest what had happened in Rwanda, and there was a strong never again, we cannot let this happen constituency in the United States that said, we cannot let this happen again. So how and why states decide to do these interventions is complex. What I'm interested in is, yes, there are these variations like this, but then there are big changes. Certain kinds of choices just are not even choices anymore. No one is entertaining this as a choice. No one sits in the Treasury Department now and says, let's send the Marines to Venezuela to collect our debts. No one's going to do that in the 21st century. They don't even think about it. Well, why? It would still be easy. We could do it. But it doesn't even occur to anyone. And that change is what I want to understand. Yes, please.
Professor, welcome to MGIMO.
Thank you.
And my question is, to you as a scholar of the international relations and as a human being, would you say a state will still be justified in intervening in another sovereign state if the intervening state has constantly misled the international community on past interventions, which ironically subsequently led to actual major humanitarian crises? For example, I would say Lyndon B. Johnson's Vietnam and the Gulf of Tonkin, and Iraq, and of course Obama's Libya and Syria campaigns, which were on the basis of misleading the international community. Would you say the state is still justified in continuing its interventionist agenda?
Again, another good question. As a scholar, I don't understand my job to be to decide, is your diplomatic action justified or is it not justified? What I want to do is understand, how do other states react to your action? Why do they do what they do? Why are you going to do this misleading thing, and why are this other state, what are they going to respond to that? So as a scholar, I don't see my job as passing judgment, you're right, you're wrong. That's not what I know how to do or what I want to do. What I want to do is understand, why are you so misleading, and why is he accepting this, or why is he shooting guns at you in response? I want to understand why they do these things. But for example, the Libya case is an interesting one, because that was a case where R2P was invoked at the Security Council. And the Americans were actually rather reluctant. The French were pushing this hard. And I think the Americans decided this didn't go very well. They were not happy about it. They did it once and said, it's learning again. They tried this and said, I don't know about this. And we're not so eager later to embrace this. So it will take some time as states go through more episodes and learn lessons about what they think makes sense to them, what they can defend at home to their own constituents, what actually turns out well militarily in the end for them. You know, they're going to make different kinds of choices about this. And I just don't know how the fate of R2P will come out at the end. Oh, yes, please.
Thank you so much again and again. This is already the second lecture, unfortunately, because they're going to be over. I wanted to ask you about the Poland thing. If you care about how states react to any kind of situation in the world, I'd like to throw the Poland example. An example you already said about the annexation of Crimea or reunification.
Oh, sorry. Excuse me. Yes. Okay. All right. I apologize. Yes. Language is everything. I understand.
That's not the case here. I just wanted to ask you, well, for example, there was the year 2008 when Russia, probably according to the ideas of any experts, intervened in South Syria, and there were no huge repercussions for Russia, and there were no huge ramifications for Russia. Nobody actually reacted to that case, probably to the full extent as they did in the case of Crimea. So, as a scholar and as a representative of constructivism, could you please tell why in that case, in 2008, the government did not react to it as they did react in the case of Crimea?
I wish I knew more. I don't know enough, I think, about some of the details, particularly of the Ossetia case. But you've put your finger on, that's exactly the kind of question that would be important to research for this. I also don't know what I would want to know about both of those cases. I think great powers can pretty much take for granted that no one's going to intervene in them. No one's going to intervene in Russia. Let's just be very clear about this, right? This is a problem for weak states. And no one's going to intervene in the United States, and no one's going to intervene in China about these Hong Kong things. So the big states, military intervention is not a problem for big states in the sense they are never the targets. Military interventions are an option for big states. So as a scholar, I want to understand why would big states choose to do an intervention when that is actually a possibility. They could do it if they wanted. Why do they choose not to do it? So at some level, there'll be a hue and cry about, there was lots of diplomatic activity around both of these cases, but the tools at states' disposal to discipline Russia are very, very, military force is not one of those tools. So big states, in this sense, the realists are right? The big states can do what they want, but what I'm interested in is, if big states can do what they want, what will they choose? And when will they restrain themselves and not intervene? So why do big states choose to intervene to help some people who are being slaughtered and not others? Why do they choose to intervene in some political situations and not in other political situations? Because big states could stay home, they could deploy force. The choice is theirs, but there's a pattern to the choice. some choices just disappear, and they don't even consider it anymore. And why is that the case? This, I think, how big powers react to each other's deployments of force is a different case than this one. It's just not, we wouldn't call that military intervention. If the US did anything about Russian activity, if the Russians tried to do anything about US activity, we might end up in what is unambiguously a war. Really, it's not an intervention, it's a war. And that's a different kind of logic, I think, than this. It's just a different research question. Yes, please.
Thank you for a very interesting lecture. You just mentioned that some countries are immune to state intervention. Then how can you explain why major states like Russia are very cautious about the idea of constructivist?
Well, in some ways, I think, the Russians have a lot of company and a lot of friends and supporters in this resistance to responsibility to protect. I think there are a couple of features of this. The Chinese would be right with the Russians, saying this is not such a good idea. And they've been very clear. The Security Council dynamics on this are very clear, right? So it's the US, the British, and the French who are interested in this. It's Soviets and it's the Soviets, sorry. I've been doing too much history. It's the Russians and the Americans who are the Russians and the it's the Russians and the Chinese who are very suspicious about this. And a lot of it has to do, I think, with what kinds of notions these great powers themselves are comfortable with in their own sovereignty. I think if I were China, I don't want to give any state the idea that it's okay to intervene to protect people in other countries, because in fact, I have some minorities in my country, and I'm doing some rather repressive things to those minorities, and I don't want to change international law or international understandings such that my preferred policies are illegal. Why would I do that? That would be terrible. States that, the responsibility to protect, understandably, looks like a challenge to sovereign control. In earlier understandings of sovereignty, sovereignty emphasized the rights of states to have control over what goes on in their own territory. If you want to abuse your own citizens, that is between you and your citizens. Other states don't have a legal right to do much about it. Responsibility to protect would change that and say it is right, good, and proper for other states to concern themselves with what you're doing internally. And I think Russia and China are saying, no, that is not the way we understand sovereignty and what we think is a good idea. At least that's how I would interpret what the conversation I'm watching these countries have. And you can look at the other 180-something states, and you can see them falling on both sides of these debates in the UN along those kinds of lines. There are states who really don't want anyone messing around in their internal affairs, and other states who are more open to this idea. So, the politics are continuing to fall out across these lines, and I just don't know how this argument is going to settle itself over time. Please.
You earlier mentioned that we live in a political system in which if big states would just walk into other sovereign states, then the whole international system would act differently. However, the examples of Iraq and Crimea show us that this has happened, and the reactions have been diplomatic crisis, economic tension, but none of this has proved to be an effective deterrent for the action itself. So do you think there should be a change in the sanction system, in the political system of the international system, or do you think this just has to go on and the change should come from the states themselves?
I guess, thank you again, it's a good question. I'm putting myself in the shoes of policymakers in national capitals who have to make the decisions about these things. And the question would be, in part, what is the world of the possible? So if George Bush decides he wants to invade Iraq, who's going to do anything about this? This goes back to this, the big states, international law doesn't always restrain them. We know this. This has always been true. You know, the lawyers are, when I talk to my friends in international law, they're often very sensitive to this criticism from political scientists and international relations scholars that international law is irrelevant, nobody pays attention, they invade. Iraq is a great example. And the international lawyers are always offended by this, and their mantra, they keep saying, yes, but most states, most of the time, do obey these rules. And these episodes that are coming to our heads are the exceptions. And in domestic society, we see this too. Most people, most of the time, are not stealing wallets every time they had a chance to steal a wallet, and they're not stealing laptops, and they're not, you know, bashing people over the heads and running away with their purses. Most people, most of the time, follow the rules. And when the problem is, how do you respond when people break the rules? Domestically, we have police and a legal code. Internationally, this is a long problem. And I would say that the United States suffered, again, serious political costs for the Iraq invasion. I remember a colleague telling me when it was announced that we were going in, they just said, this is the end of the American hegemony. It is over now, because no one will pay any attention anymore. And, but it's not clear, even if you're domestic, you know, even if you're part of this country, you can't always stop them from doing these things, right? So I don't think, it does mean, I think, that the next American presidents are going to be more cautious, because this did not turn out to be a good adventure for the Americans. This has not gone at all the way George Bush thought it was going to go. And you can see Obama is much more cautious. And Donald Trump, who is an interesting character, but he's cautious. He doesn't actually want a war, I think. I don't know. We'll see. I hope not. But there's been a lot of caution because, again, this goes back to this learning. States are, you know, they deploy military force. They see how that goes. And if it goes well, okay. If it doesn't go well, they rethink what they think a good rule might look like. So, but you put your finger on a very thorny problem. I don't have a good answer to that one. I would be a very rich or important person if I did, but I don't. So, okay, good. We're done? Are we done?